The night air carried a crisp chill, a soft breath of autumn settling over the town. I had gone out for a walk, seeking solace from another sleepless evening. My usual route led me past the old Thornby estate, a once grand mansion that had long since fallen into disrepair. Its gates were rusted, the gardens overgrown, yet something about the place always tugged at my curiosity. Tonight, a peculiar glint caught my eye as I passed the crumbling garden wall. A faint red shimmer pulsed from within the tangled bushes, a color too vibrant for the muted tones of the season. I hesitated, the rational part of me urging caution, but an inexplicable pull urged me forward. Stepping through a gap in the gate, I made my way into the garden. The air changed as I crossed the threshold, heavier, colder, and filled with a stillness that made me pause. The garden, despite its neglect, seemed alive with an unnatural vitality. Leaves whispered against each other in a soundless wind, and the overgrown path seemed to guide me toward the source of the glow. Then I saw it. In the heart of the chaos, surrounded by gnarled branches and wild thorns, stood a single rose. Its petals were the richest crimson, glistening as though dusted with dew despite the chill. The closer I got, the more I realized the shimmer wasn't a reflection of light. It seemed to emanate from the rose itself, as if it carried its own luminescence. I reached out, my hand trembling as I drew closer. My fingers stopped mere inches from the bloom, an instinctive warning ringing in my mind. The air around it was different, thick with an electric charge that raised the hairs on my arm. It felt like the moment before a thunderstorm, heavy with anticipation. Who had planted it here? How had it survived in this forgotten place? My thoughts swirled as I stared, entranced. Despite its unnatural beauty, a faint sense of unease took root in my chest. It wasn't just a flower. It was something more, something that didn't belong. Before I could think further, the sound of a distant church bell broke the spell. Midnight. I shivered, suddenly aware of how long I had been standing there. I pulled back and left the garden quickly, though the image of the rose lingered in my mind, vivid and unshakable. That night, I dreamt of the rose. Its petals unfurled slowly, each revealing a gleaming drop of crimson dew that fell onto dark soil. The drops spread, forming a pool that reflected the moon, and in its rippling surface I saw a face. It was my own, distorted and pale, its eyes hollow. I woke with a start, the vision clinging to me like a shadow. The unease hadn't faded, but something else had taken hold, a deep, irrational need to see the rose again. Word of the rose spread quicker than I expected. I hadn't told anyone directly, but it seemed news of my late-night discovery had seeped into the town like ink through fabric. The story grew as it traveled. An enchanted flower, a bloom said to grant wishes, to foretell love. Each retelling added new layers, spinning the truth into something fantastical. At first, I found it amusing, if not slightly unsettling. But then the visitors began. It started innocently enough, curious townsfolk venturing into the old garden, eager to glimpse the flower for themselves. They returned with stories of its unearthly beauty, each description echoing my own experience. Yet, with every person who admired it, strange coincidences began to unfold. Mrs. Elwood, a kind but gossipy shopkeeper, was the first. She had stopped by the garden during her morning walk, according to her neighbor. By afternoon, the news had spread that she'd tripped on her doorstep, spraining her ankle so severely she would be bedridden for weeks. Then there was Daniel, the town's mail carrier. He mentioned seeing the rose to a group of us at the cafe, describing its allure in great detail. By the next morning, he had lost his voice entirely, his throat swollen and raw, leaving him unable to work. I dismissed these events at first. Accidents happen, I reasoned, and coincidences are nothing more than the whims of chance. But as the pattern grew, so did my unease. Each person who admired the rose seemed to suffer some misfortune within days. A cracked window here, a ruined crop there. It was never anything severe, but the frequency was impossible to ignore. Soon, whispers began to circulate. The cursed rose, they called it. Some spoke of it in hushed tones, wary of attracting its ire, while others scoffed at the idea, dismissing the rumors as superstition. Still, fewer people dared to approach the garden, and those who had lingered too long began to avoid it altogether. Despite the warnings, my own fascination with the rose only deepened. I couldn't stop thinking about it, Bayou. Its image burned into my mind like a lingering ember. I found myself drawn back to the garden one evening, the moonlight casting long shadows across the overgrown path. As I neared the rose, my breath caught. It had changed. The petals, once a vivid crimson, now carried faint streaks of black, as though ink had bled into them. The shimmer was still there, but it seemed dimmer, less inviting. I took a step back, the weight of dread pressing against my chest. The rose wasn't just beautiful. It was alive, and I realized with chilling clarity that it was changing in response to us. The following days were marked by unease. Though I tried to distance myself from the rose, it seemed to haunt my every thought. My dreams were no better. They were filled with twisting vines and petals that bled ink, whispers brushing against my ears but too faint to understand. Each morning, I woke with a growing certainty that the rose was watching me, as absurd as it sounded. Determined to rid myself of this fixation, I delved into the history of the Thornby estate. At the town's small library, I pored over old records and newspaper clippings. The garden had once been a place of beauty, meticulously tended by Eleanor Thornby, the late mistress of the estate. Her passion for gardening was legendary, and the estate had flourished under her care, until tragedy struck. Eleanor had fallen ill one winter, a sickness that no doctor could cure. Rumors of her decline spread, tinged with whispers of curses and dark magic. According to a weathered journal entry from the town's historical records, Eleanor's final act was planting a single rose in her beloved garden. Some believed it was a tribute to a love she had lost. Others claimed it was a desperate plea to escape death. Whatever the truth, the rose had bloomed the night she passed away, as if born from her very breath. The more I learned, the more the unease in my chest solidified. Eleanor's rose had been described in those records much like the one I had found. Impossibly vivid and strangely alive. But the account stopped abruptly, as if the townsfolk had decided the story was best left untold. I returned to the garden that evening, curiosity outweighing the fear gnawing at me. The air was heavier than before, each step sinking me deeper into an oppressive stillness. The rose glowed faintly in the moonlight, the streaks of black now thicker, threading through the petals like veins. As I stood there, a soft sound reached me, barely audible, like a breath against the wind. I strained to listen. It was a whisper, faint and indistinct, coming from the direction of the rose. My heart raced as I stepped closer, the sound growing clearer. Words began to form, though I couldn't make sense of them. Lost. Found. I froze, the whispers now threading through my mind as if they belonged there. The rose was speaking, or something tied to it was. I stumbled back, tripping over the gnarled roots of an overgrown bush. The whispers faded, leaving me with a sense of disconnection, like waking from a half-remembered dream. I didn't linger. By the time I reached my front door, I was shaking, my hands cold despite the warmth of the house. The rose wasn't just alive. It was sentient, tethered to something far beyond comprehension, and it wanted something from me. The whispers didn't stop after that night. Even away from the garden, I heard faint voices echoing in the quiet corners of my mind. They were insistent, murmuring broken phrases that felt both foreign and familiar. "You must," one said, clear as a bell, startling me awake one night. Must what? I couldn't say, but the more I tried to ignore them, the louder they became. It wasn't just the whispers. Objects around my home began to shift subtly, as if nudged by an unseen hand. A book would fall from its shelf without reason. A teacup left on the counter would be found across the room. Each incident was small, easy to dismiss on its own, but together they formed a pattern that left me unsettled. I wasn't alone in my torment. The few who had dared approach the garden in recent weeks shared similar accounts of unease. Mrs. Elwood, still limping from her fall, confided in me one morning at the market. "I hear it at night," she said, her voice trembling. "That whispering, it's like it's calling me back." Others spoke of vivid nightmares, shadowed figures, and a growing sense that the rose was watching. It became clear that we had all been marked in some way, linked by our shared admiration of the flower. I returned to the garden one final time, not out of curiosity, but necessity. I needed answers, and they wouldn't come unless I faced the rose head-on. The whispers grew louder as I approached, weaving into a steady chant that pulled me forward against my better judgment. The rose had changed again. The petals were almost entirely black now, their glow muted to a faint ember. Around its base, the thorns had grown thick and sharp, twisting into unnatural patterns. The air shimmered faintly, as though the flower existed slightly out of sync with the rest of the world. I knelt before it, my breath shallow. "What are you?" I whispered, half hoping it wouldn't answer. The whispers coalesced into a single, chilling voice. "A bond. A choice." The thorns shifted, spreading to reveal something nestled within the rose's center, a single drop of liquid, glistening like molten ruby. It pulsed faintly, radiating warmth even from a distance. The voice spoke again, softer now, but no less commanding. "Take it. Accept the bond." I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to run, but something deeper, something beyond reason, held me there. The rose pulsed in time with my racing heartbeat, its glow dimming as if to fade completely. "No," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I can't." The garden seemed to exhale, a soft, almost mournful sound that swept through the stillness. The thorns retreated, the glow of the rose fading further. I stumbled back, my chest tight with the weight of what I had refused. The rose wasn't just cursed. It was a living promise, waiting for someone to carry its burden. And I had walked away. But as I left the garden, I knew the bond was far from severed. The days after my refusal were shrouded in a dreadful quiet. The whispers that had plagued me since my first encounter with the rose had ceased, leaving behind an unsettling void. Yet the absence of sound was no relief. Instead, it felt like the moment before a storm, a silence brimming with tension, as if the world were holding its breath. Each night, my dreams grew darker, pulling me into shadowy landscapes of twisted thorns and withering blooms. The rose was always there, at the center of the dreamscapes, its blackened petals trembling as though alive. And though the whispers were gone, the rose's presence pressed against me, a wordless demand that I could not escape. On the 7th night, I woke to find my room filled with a faint, floral scent, sweet and cloying, yet carrying an edge of decay. My breath hitched as I sat up, scanning the shadows for the source. The faint light of the moon revealed nothing unusual, but the scent lingered, heavy and oppressive. It felt as though the rose had followed me home, weaving itself into the very air I breathed. Unable to shake the sense of being watched, I returned to the garden the next morning, my resolve shaky but firm. If I had learned anything, it was that running would not free me from its grasp. Whatever bond I had unknowingly formed, it demanded closure. The garden was different now. The overgrown path seemed darker, the foliage denser, as if the garden itself was closing in around the rose. A chill swept through me as I approached the heart of the chaos. The rose, once vibrant and alluring, was now a shadow of its former self. Its petals were fully blackened, their edges curling inward as though retreating from the world. The glow had vanished entirely, leaving it cold and lifeless. I knelt before it, unsure of what to do. My voice trembled as I spoke, the words spilling out unbidden. "What do you want from me?" For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, faintly, I felt it, a shift in the air, like a sigh passing through the garden. A single petal detached from the rose, drifting downward with an unnatural slowness. It landed in the palm of my hand, its surface smooth but cold, almost metallic. A wave of images flooded my mind as I held the petal, a love unfulfilled, a plea unanswered, a curse woven into the threads of time. I saw Eleanor Thornby, her frail form planting the rose with trembling hands. Her voice, clear and sorrowful, whispered through my thoughts. "Free it. Free me." My breath caught as realization dawned. The rose was not simply cursed. It was a vessel, a tether holding Eleanor's spirit captive. Her final act of love had been twisted by grief and desperation, binding her to the bloom. And now, after decades of solitude, she sought release. The petal pulsed faintly in my hand, urging me to act. I hesitated, fear coursing through me. What if this was a trick? What if surrendering to its demand would bind me in her place? Yet, as I gazed at the withered rose, I felt a pang of empathy for the spirit trapped within. Her sorrow was tangible, echoing in every brittle curve of the bloom. Gathering my courage, I closed my hand around the petal and whispered, "I accept." The garden responded immediately. A gust of wind swept through the overgrowth, carrying the scent of the rose into the air. The petals disintegrated into shimmering dust, swirling upward in a soft glow before fading into the sky. The heaviness in the air lifted, replaced by a serene stillness. When I opened my eyes, the rose was gone. In its place was a small patch of grass, unremarkable except for the faint warmth that lingered there. The oppressive pull of the garden had vanished, leaving me with a sense of quiet finality. As I turned to leave, the whispers returned. Not ominous this time, but soft and grateful, like a breeze brushing past my ear. "Thank you." I left the garden that day, its gates swinging closed behind me, with a finality that echoed in my chest. Though the rose was gone, its memory lingered, etched into my thoughts like a faded dream. And though I felt no triumph, no joy, there was a strange comfort in knowing I had ended something long overdue. The whispers never returned, nor did the unsettling dreams. But sometimes, when the air is still and the scent of roses wafts unexpectedly through my window, I can't help but wonder if Eleanor is free, or if some part of her will always remain, watching, waiting.